He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in the arena. Not in that wheelchair. Not after the mountain tore his spine apart 2 winters ago. But Sawyer Boone, once a golden boy of Colorado's wild Rio circuits, wheeled himself into the spotlight, one push at a time. No saddle, no whip, just a soft voice, a broken body, and the storm of a Mustang waiting to be tamed. They said Stormfall couldn't be touched, but when the boy with no legs met the horse with no master, the world stopped breathing. Because what happened next wasn't a trick. It was trust, raw, unspoken, and soul deep. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The morning mist hung low over Durango, Colorado, softening the jagged silhouettes of the San Juan Mountains. Pines stood like solemn sentinels, their branches trembling under the weight of dew, while the sky, bruised with clouds, threatened a late spring storm. The wind whispered through the valley, cool and clean, carrying with it the scent of soil, cedar, and horses. On the edge of town, the fairgrounds stirred to life with the buzz of voices and the metallic clang of gates. The Silver Hoof Equestrian Festival had begun. In the main arena, tension charged the air like static. Sawdust churned beneath boots and hooves, and banners flapped restlessly above the stands. A crowd had gathered, bundled in jackets, their breath visible in the morning chill, all eyes fixed on the corral at the center. Inside it stood a creature as wild as the storm that brewed above. Stormfall. He was enormous for a Mustang, nearly 17 hands high, with a coat the color of wet obsidian, sleek and gleaming as if carved from night itself. His mane flowed like riverweed in motion, tangled and wind-swept. His nostrils flared wide, steam puffing from them in bursts, and his amber eyes, framed by jagged white scars from unknown battles, burned with defiance. 4 men had tried to mount him that week. All 4 had failed. 1 had left in an ambulance. "He doesn't break," someone muttered in the stands. "He breaks you." Handlers kept a wide berth as Stormfall paced, ears flat, hooves slicing the ground. Every step was measured and furious, as if he carried thunder in his bones. His muscles flexed with primal purpose, his movements untamed, as though he resented every breath of domestic air forced upon him. At the edge of the corral, a boy watched in silence. His name was Sawyer Boone, and he didn't stand among the spectators. He sat, low and still, in a matte black wheelchair. Sawyer was 16, with sunburned skin stretched taut over a wiry frame. His hair, once shaggy and windswept from long rides, now hung neatly behind his ears. His eyes, a quiet steel blue, carried the weight of someone twice his age. Eyes that had once looked out from atop prize-winning saddles, now fixed from waist level on the creature no one could touch. He wore a simple gray hoodie and jeans, his hands gripping the wheels with white-knuckled focus. 2 winters ago, Sawyer had been the youngest rider ever to win the 4-state open rodeo. He had been fire and wind, flashing through competitions with a grin. Unafraid, unbeaten. But on a trip to Purgatory Ski Resort, one wrong turn sent his body tumbling down a ravine. His back cracked like dry wood. The doctor said it was a miracle he lived. They didn't call it a tragedy. They left that part for him to figure out. Beside him stood a tall, lean woman in a sage-green coat. Laurel Boone, Sawyer's mother, had the poise of a woman who had spent her life containing chaos. Her frame was slight but firm, like the bending strength of willow wood. Gray strands threaded through her long auburn hair, and her hazel eyes were sharp, though softened by exhaustion. She had been a veterinary nurse before the accident, a profession that required equal parts tenderness and tenacity, traits she now used daily with her son. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently, leaning closer. Sawyer said nothing. Laurel had brought him here not for closure, but for hope. She remembered what he used to be like, how alive he'd been on a horse, how the wind had seemed to lift him toward something higher. Since the accident, silence had taken up residence in their home. Not anger, not rebellion, just stillness, heavy as winter snow. Now, watching him inch toward the corral, she held her breath. The announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, half amused. "Ladies and gentlemen, looks like we've got a new challenger for Stormfall. And well, let's just say he's got wheels instead of spurs." Laughter rose from the crowd, low and uncomfortable. Some people chuckled. Others looked away. Sawyer didn't blink. He rolled forward on the gravel, one slow push at a time, his wheelchair crunching toward the edge of the sand. His heart beat hard against his ribs, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. Stormfall turned his head sharply, ears twitching. His hooves struck the dirt with a thud. He saw Sawyer, and he didn't like what he saw. Stormfall reared, muscles coiling, a cry tearing from his throat like lightning split through it. The crowd gasped and began murmuring again. "What's he doing?" someone asked. "He's just a kid." "He's not even standing," said another. Laurel gripped the rail with trembling fingers. But Sawyer didn't flinch. He wheeled himself forward again until he was just inside the arena's edge. And then he stopped. He locked eyes with the stallion. It wasn't a stare of defiance or challenge. It wasn't control he offered. It was understanding. "I know what it's like," Sawyer whispered, barely audible above the wind. "To be caged." Stormfall snorted, hooves scraping the dirt. "I know what it's like to fight everything, even the people trying to help. I know what it's like to lose the only thing that made you feel free." And then, an impossible thing happened. Stormfall lowered his head, slow and deliberate. His ears turned forward. His breath grew shallow. He stepped forward once, then twice. The crowd held their breath. Sawyer didn't move. He didn't speak again. Stormfall, the beast no one could approach, the one even hardened wranglers had called possessed, inched closer until his muzzle hovered a foot from the boy's chest. And then, like some unspoken ritual from another world, Stormfall bent his front knees and bowed. Gasps broke across the arena. For a long moment, no one moved. Laurel covered her mouth, her eyes brimming. The handlers froze mid-step, as if a loud sound would shatter the moment. Even the announcer was silent. Sawyer exhaled, barely a smile breaking across his lips. He didn't know why Stormfall responded the way he did. Only that something inside them, both boy and beast, had cracked open just enough to let the other in. And sometimes, that's all it takes. The lights of Durango flickered like distant stars beneath the gathering dusk. The mountain wind had shifted. Cooler now, rustling through pine needles and whispering down narrow alleys like secrets that refused to stay buried. The news of what had happened at the Silver Hoof Equestrian Festival had already spread beyond the fairgrounds. It drifted from truck beds at gas stations, across old-timers sipping coffee at the corner diner, even through the radios of sheriff's cruisers idling at canyon passes. They all said the same thing. The boy in the wheelchair made the beast kneel. Sawyer Boone didn't want any of it. He sat on the back porch of their log cabin home, nestled in the foothills just outside town, staring out across the darkening tree line. His wheelchair creaked beneath him as he adjusted his weight, but his gaze didn't move. The only sound was the steady click of his thumb against the wheel rim, a nervous rhythm he'd adopted since the accident. His mother, Laurel, hadn't said much since the festival. She'd cooked chili, folded laundry, fed the dogs, 2 aging Labradors named Moss and Ginny, but she hadn't asked the question he knew was coming. Until now. "He called today," she said gently, her voice softened by the porch shadows. "The trainer, Eddie Gallows." Sawyer flinched, barely perceptible. Laurel stepped out beside him, folding her arms over her chest. "He wants you to come to the stables, not to ride, just to be around him, around the horse." Sawyer didn't answer. His lips parted slightly, then pressed shut again. Laurel turned toward him, studying the boy she once watched ride like he had wings. She reached out and brushed a strand of wind-blown hair from his eyes. "You don't have to go," she added. "But you should know," he said. "Stormfall hasn't let anyone else near him since that day, not even to feed." Sawyer looked down at his lap. "Maybe he sees something in me," he murmured. "Something broken." Laurel didn't respond. She just let the silence stretch between them like a hammock strung over grief. Eddie Gallows was a man carved by sun and time. Tall, broad-shouldered, with leathery skin that looked like it had been shaped by years of wind and dirt. His hair, once black, was now more silver than gray, and his mustache drooped like the heavy tails of his old trail dogs. He had run the Gallows Ridge Horse Sanctuary for 37 years, long enough to know the difference between a spooked animal and one who'd been betrayed. He'd seen horses rear, bolt, bite, but never had he seen one bow. Not like Stormfall had. The next morning, Sawyer arrived at the sanctuary with Laurel. The facility sprawled across a quiet stretch of land, bordered by aspens and open sky. It wasn't fancy, wooden paddocks lined with chicken wire, a long, low barn, and dust in every crevice. A black and white border collie with one ear flopped over came trotting up to greet them. "That's Banjo," Eddie grunted as he approached. "He won't bite, just acts like he might." Banjo wagged his tail furiously, then dropped a ball at Sawyer's wheel. Eddie gave Sawyer a slow, assessing look. "You got people talking, kid, but this ain't a circus act. We don't do miracles here, just patience and grit." Sawyer gave a half smile, faint but real. "That's all I've got left." Eddie motioned toward the barn. "Let's see what your storm horse thinks about that." Stormfall had been isolated in a side corral farther from the main paddocks where his pacing wouldn't spook the other horses. But he wasn't pacing now. He stood perfectly still, staring at the boy approaching him in the chair. No one had touched him since the festival. Not Eddie, not the assistants, not even the vet who'd needed binoculars just to check his gait. Sawyer wheeled forward alone, the gravel crunching under him. He didn't speak, didn't lift a hand, he just looked. Stormfall blinked once, then took a step forward. The gate creaked in the wind behind them, but neither boy nor beast flinched. "Easy," Sawyer said softly. The Mustang let out a long breath, lips fluttering. Then he took another step, just one, but it was enough. Inside the barn, a new figure watched from the shadows. Sierra Vance, a part-time stable hand and aspiring animal behaviorist, had auburn curls tucked into a braid, freckles across her cheeks, and hands always caked in dust. At 19, she had a reputation for stubborn loyalty and late-night reading habits. She had grown up around broken things. Dogs dumped on the highway, horses with cracked hooves, a father who'd left and never looked back. That left her quiet, observant, and unwilling to believe in fairy tales. But even she couldn't look away. After Sawyer left for the day, Sierra approached Eddie. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked, tossing a lead rope onto the hook. "That we've got a boy who might just fix what years of training couldn't," Eddie muttered. "That, or the horse is fixing him." That night, back at home, Sawyer lay in bed with the window cracked open, the mountain wind curling into the room. He dreamt of hooves pounding snow, of a blinding white slope, of his legs, before. And then, of Stormfall's breath warming his face, steady and alive. In his dream, the horse didn't bow. He walked beside him, and Sawyer wasn't riding, he was just moving forward. By the third morning, the clouds over Durango had shifted to a pale, forgetful blue. Spring sunlight crept softly over the fence posts at Gallows Ridge, gilding the barn roof in quiet gold. The scent of hay mingled with the sharp crisp of pine in the breeze, and somewhere in the near distance, the warble of a magpie rang out like a stubborn melody, refusing to be ignored. For Sawyer Boone, this was the first time the morning air didn't sting. He arrived at the stables just after dawn, his wheelchair humming softly along the gravel path. Laurel drove him, as always, but she no longer waited with hovering worry. She parked under the sycamore tree and sat in silence, knitting in her lap, eyes occasionally lifting to watch her son and the great black Mustang moving across the field like shadows circling each other. Stormfall had begun to change. The wildness hadn't vanished. It still pulsed in the way his ears flicked at sudden sounds, in the caution held in his joints, but he no longer snorted at Sawyer's approach. He didn't rear or pace, didn't bare his teeth or bolt to the far end of the corral. Instead, he watched. He blinked. And some mornings, he stepped forward first. Sawyer never brought ropes, never reached out. He simply sat near the corral fence, reading aloud from an old, worn paperback his mother had found in the attic. The Red Pony by John Steinbeck. His voice was low and unhurried, and though Stormfall surely didn't understand the words, he seemed to understand the rhythm, the steadiness, the intent. Sometimes Sawyer would pause mid-paragraph just to look at him, and Stormfall would tilt his head in that curious, almost human way that made the world feel mythic. Not everyone saw magic. The town had started talking. At Durango Feed and Grain, where ranchers gathered for morning coffee, murmurs had begun. Words like reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous were passed between mouthfuls of egg biscuit. One of the loudest voices belonged to Wade Kelton, a barrel-chested rancher in his late 40s, with sun-leathered skin and a belt buckle big enough to serve coffee on. Wade had lost 2 fingers to a bronco in '09 and had since developed an uncompromising hatred for untamed animals. "I don't care what that crippled kid did in the ring," Wade barked one morning. "You let a paralyzed boy play whisperer with a beast like that, you're asking for a lawsuit or a tragedy." Behind the counter, Jenna Morales, the cafe's owner, narrowed her eyes. A short, no-nonsense woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair and a deep fondness for lost causes, she leaned forward and said, "That crippled kid has more sense than half the men in this room, and maybe what that horse needs isn't another boot to the ribs, but someone who knows what pain feels like." Jenna's brother had died in Vietnam, a gentle soul who never raised his voice, even under fire. She had watched how the world dismissed soft strength as weakness. She wouldn't let it happen again, not on her watch. At Gallows Ridge, Sierra Vance had become more than just an observer. Each day, she joined Sawyer by the fence, handing him apple slices or brushing down the outer corral. She wasn't quick to speak. Her friendship, like her trust, came slow and real. "You don't touch him?" she asked one afternoon. "No," Sawyer replied. "He decides." Sierra nodded thoughtfully. "Most people want to control everything. You're doing the opposite." Sawyer looked down at his useless legs. "I stopped believing I had control a long time ago." Stormfall stood a dozen feet away, head lowered, watching. Eddie Gallows had noticed. Every evening after chores, he stood alone near the barn door, staring into the dusk as Sawyer wheeled himself to the car. Eddie had begun cleaning Stormfall's tack, though no one had used it in months. He hadn't said it aloud, but the hard lines around his mouth had softened. "Not bad, Boone," he muttered once as Sawyer passed. "Not bad at all." The bond between boy and horse deepened, not with spectacle, but with silence. Some days, Sawyer would sit and hum old songs, tuneless, broken melodies that wandered like the wind. Other times, he said nothing at all, just listened to the creak of leather, the shuffle of hooves, and the heartbeats that had learned to keep time together. Stormfall had stopped bowing. He didn't need to. Now he came closer. Close enough for breath to mingle. Close enough that one morning, he lowered his great head and rested it, just for a moment, against the wheel of Sawyer's chair. Sawyer didn't cry, but Laurel did, watching from the truck. That night, a letter arrived in the Boone mailbox, typed on official Durango County letterhead. It had been signed by a concerned citizen, though it didn't say who. The message was simple. "This needs to stop. You're putting a child in danger, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt. That horse is wild. That boy is broken. Don't make a martyr out of misery." Laurel's hands trembled as she read it. She folded the paper carefully, then placed it on the kitchen table. When Sawyer asked what it was, she smiled gently. "Just noise," she said. He nodded, but his eyes were shadowed. That night he dreamed of cages, not bars, but voices, and Stormfall, breaking them down. The morning of the San Juan Liberty Horse Exhibition broke clear and cold. High above Durango, the peaks gleamed with snow, a late spring dusting that glittered like powdered silver beneath the rising sun. A thin fog curled through the trees as Sawyer Boone sat quietly in the trailer beside Stormfall's travel pen. The world outside was already buzzing. Vendors setting up tents, announcers testing microphones, hoofbeats clattering against wooden ramps. But inside, it was still, peaceful. Stormfall stood just behind him, tethered loosely in the corner. The black Mustang's coat shimmered like polished obsidian in the light. At 6 years old, he was leaner now, less tense in his frame. There were still flashes of wildness in the way he held his head, alert and high, but he no longer vibrated with suspicion. Not around Sawyer. Sawyer ran his hand over the wheel of his chair, his chest tight. This was different. This wasn't the quiet corral behind Gallows Ridge. This was a public arena, and he could already feel the weight of thousands of eyes pressing against the morning mist. Laurel entered the trailer carrying a folded denim shirt. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded, but didn't speak. She kneeled beside him, brushing his hair back, the way she had when he was 5 and afraid of lightning. "You don't have to prove anything, sweetheart. Not to them, not even to him." Sawyer finally looked at her. "I know." Her hand lingered for a moment on his shoulder, then she stood and opened the trailer door. A blast of cool air swept through the space. "They're ready." The exhibition grounds sat at the edge of Silver Ridge, a wide, open field turned amphitheater, ringed by log bleachers and prayer flags that fluttered above the audience. A crowd of over 3,000 had gathered. Some came for the spectacle, others for the stories. Backstage, Sawyer sat beside Eddie Gallows, who wore his usual dusty jeans and a weathered Stetson pulled low over his brow. The old man had been silent most of the morning, But now he leaned close. "Listen to me, Boone," he said, voice gravely. "You ain't here to impress. You're here to tell the truth. And truth ain't always loud." Sawyer looked at him, eyes wide with fear and awe. "What if Stormfall doesn't follow me this time?" "Then he doesn't," Eddie said simply. "But you still showed up." From across the paddock, Sierra Vance gave a subtle wave. Her red braid swung over her shoulder, her eyes steady, grounding. "Just be you," she mouthed. The announcer's voice cracked over the speakers. "Now entering the ring, a special exhibition. No saddle, no reins, just the trust between a boy and a wild stallion. Please welcome Sawyer Boone and Stormfall." A hush fell over the arena. Sawyer wheeled himself slowly onto the grass. The crowd, expecting pageantry, sat confused at first. No music, no flares, just the whisper of wheels and the thunder of hooves behind. Stormfall walked behind him, freely, untethered. Each step was deliberate, heavy, as if testing the earth. His eyes scanned the arena with alert suspicion, ears twitching at the movement, but he didn't bolt. He stayed close, his shadow almost overlapping Sawyer's. Sawyer stopped at the center of the field and turned to face him. The two stood still for a long time. Wind stirred the dust at their feet. Then, without command or gesture, Sawyer whispered, "If you want to." And Stormfall moved. He walked forward, one step, then another, until his massive frame stood directly in front of the chair. His breath came in soft clouds, his eyes were calm. And then, with a slow, reverent movement, Stormfall bowed. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It wasn't submission, it wasn't a trick, it was a choice. For one breathless moment, everything stopped. The wind, the whispers, the doubt. It was just the boy in the chair and the horse that had refused everyone else. Then the applause came, thunderous, rising like a wave that broke over the mountain valley. Sawyer didn't smile. He placed a hand over his chest and nodded once. They wheeled out slowly, side by side. No rush. No need to linger. The moment had already been made. By nightfall, the video had gone viral. Clips flooded social media. The boy who made the storm kneel. Sawyer Boone breaking barriers without a bridle. Hashtags trended. News anchors replayed the footage in slow motion. Local reporters called. National reporters followed. But fame had two faces. By morning, the comments had shifted. Accusations rolled in. "This is staged. The horse was trained off camera. Dangerous to glorify disability as spectacle. That kid's being used for attention." Sawyer sat at the kitchen table, reading every word, his knuckles pale against the phone. Laurel tried to take it from him, but he wouldn't let go. Later that evening, he sat in the empty barn alone except for the flickering light of the feed room bulb and the soft rustle of straw. Stormfall stood in his stall, watching. Eddie found him there. The old man stood in the doorway, arms folded, hat low. "They're saying it was fake," Sawyer said without looking up. Eddie exhaled through his nose. "People say a lot of things when something real scares them." "What if they're right?" Sawyer asked. "What if it doesn't matter?" Eddie stepped inside, boots crunching gently on hay. He crouched beside the chair and laid a calloused hand on the armrest. "Kid, you didn't ask that horse to kneel. You didn't beg him. You didn't even touch him. He did it because he trusted you. And trust," he said, "can't be faked." Sawyer blinked hard but nodded. Eddie stood and turned to leave, but paused. "Besides, if it was a trick, why are you still here, talking to him and not to a camera?" The invitation came wrapped in soft language and genuine hope. A local nonprofit, Harmony Hooves Foundation, nestled on the outskirts of Pagosa Springs, had reached out to Laurel Boone with a handwritten letter sealed in blue wax. The director, a woman named Sarah Kilpatrick, had seen the footage from the San Juan exhibition and believed Sawyer and Stormfall could offer something more than inspiration. They could offer connection to children who had never spoken, never moved freely, and never known what it meant to trust something larger than themselves. Sarah was in her early 50s, tall and angular, with shoulder-length gray hair, always pulled back in a low twist. She dressed plainly, cotton blouses and thick-soled boots, but carried herself like someone who had endured and decided to lead with warmth anyway. Years ago, her only daughter had passed from a degenerative disease, and it had changed her. Not into someone bitter, but into someone brave. Now she ran the Harmony Hooves Center with soft eyes and firm hands, determined to help others find joy where she had once known only silence. When Sawyer and Laurel arrived, the center felt like another world. Set among meadows that rippled in wind like the surface of water, Harmony Hooves was quiet but alive. Children in wheelchairs or with walking braces dotted the grounds, accompanied by calm, well-groomed horses. None as wild as Stormfall, but each with its own quiet dignity. Stormfall didn't flinch. He stepped out of the trailer with grace, his head high, nostrils twitching as he took in the strange new setting. Unlike arenas and crowds, this space was filled with slow movement and gentleness. Horses grazed nearby. Therapists walked slowly, speaking in low tones. No reins, no pressure, just time. Sarah approached them at the gate, her smile soft and steady. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You and your horse? I think you're what we've been waiting for." Sawyer didn't know what to say, but Stormfall stepped forward and nudged Sarah's outstretched hand. She let out a small, breathless laugh. "She's magnificent." The first child Sawyer met was Sophie Wren, a 7-year-old girl with curly brown hair and soft features locked in stillness. Sophie had been born with severe nonverbal autism. She rarely made eye contact, and she hadn't spoken a word in her life. Her mother, Janelle, was a petite woman with a round face, often hidden behind a veil of fatigue. She sat beside her daughter with hope so quiet it barely breathed. Sawyer wheeled himself into the grassy paddock, where Sophie stood, her hand clutched tightly around the strap of a stuffed bear. Stormfall followed, slow and measured. "Sophie," Janelle whispered, "this is Sawyer, and that's his horse, Stormfall." Sophie didn't react at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the bear. But when Stormfall stepped closer, lowering his head to the level of the child's shoulder, something changed. Sophie lifted her hand, trembled, and then, with an effort that looked like the very edge of courage, she touched his mane. Janelle gasped. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. And Sawyer? He forgot the cameras, forgot the critics. He just watched as the girl who had never looked up before reached for something wild, and it stayed. Later that afternoon, another child arrived. Mason Llewellyn, aged 10, sat in a green motorized wheelchair that whirred softly over the dirt path. Mason had a spinal cord injury from a car accident 2 years prior. His arms remained functional, but he had never interacted with animals, and therapists described him as indifferent, unresponsive, protective of his own world. Mason was pale, with unkempt blonde hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He approached Stormfall with hesitation, not fear, just that brittle detachment that comes from too many disappointments. Sawyer rolled up beside him and spoke first. "I know what it's like." Mason didn't answer. This horse didn't let anyone touch him, not until he chose to. Mason turned slightly. "And he chose you?" "No," Sawyer said. "We chose each other." For a long moment, Mason said nothing. Then quietly, "Can I try?" Stormfall stood still as the boy reached out, brushing trembling fingers against his neck. The horse didn't move. He didn't need to. And in that moment, Mason smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't loud. But it was real. Sawyer and Stormfall stayed at Harmony Hooves for the next 2 days. They worked with children of all ages, each with a different story. Some cried, some laughed, some said nothing at all, but all reached. Stormfall became something sacred. Not a symbol, but a presence. He met each child with patience, with stillness, with a kind of grace no one could have trained into him. Each night, Sawyer sat by the edge of the pasture watching the sky fade from gold to violet. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Laurel would sit beside him, knitting slow and steady, while Stormfall grazed quietly in the distance. "Feels like the beginning of something," she said. Sawyer nodded. "It's not about going back," he whispered. "It's about giving forward." The final morning, as they packed to return home, Sarah pulled Sawyer aside. She handed him a photo. Mason, hand on Stormfall's muzzle, eyes lit. "He hasn't smiled in over a year," she said. Sawyer stared at the image. "He didn't smile because of me. He smiled because someone saw him." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that, Sawyer Boone, is exactly why it was you." That evening, as the sun dipped low over Durango, casting long golden fingers across the pasture, Sawyer wheeled himself down the trail behind the house. Stormfall followed behind him. No reins, no commands, just the rhythm of hoof and wheel. 2 souls walking at the same pace. There was no crowd, no cameras, no voice but the wind in the tall grass. Sawyer stopped at the top of the ridge, looking out over the valley below. Stormfall stepped beside him and stood still. Sawyer reached out. placed his palm on the warm, familiar neck of the horse who had once feared every hand. "I'm not who I was," he said softly, "but I think maybe I'm more." And Stormfall, as if in answer, exhaled, deep and slow, as the wind passed through them both like a quiet kind of resurrection. Sometimes healing doesn't mean returning to who we were. It means growing into who we're meant to be. Sawyer and Stormfall showed us that trust takes time, strength is found in quiet moments, and the most powerful connections often begin where words end. In a world that often celebrates control, this story reminds us that true change begins with patience, presence, and the courage to meet others where they are. Whether you're facing personal challenges, supporting someone through hardship, or simply trying to reconnect with your own purpose, remember, it's okay to move slowly. It's okay to rebuild. And most of all, it's okay to begin again. One small act of trust at a time. If this story touched your heart, help us share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and share the video to keep the message alive.